presentation on the Fair Labor Standards Act. We're so glad that you chose to join us this afternoon. I'm Barbara Jennings, and I am a human resources consultant at Towne Benefits. And whether you're a first-time participant or whether you've been here before, we always hope that you get a lot out of our presentation. And just a quick refresher on who I am and how I got here. I just want to let you all know that while I am not an active human resources director at this point in time, I did spend over 30 years in human resources and benefits management, and I spent most of that time in the banking and legal industries. And my job here at Towne Benefits is to help our client companies and HR managers, navigate the sometimes treacherous and tricky waters of human resources and benefits. And so once again, we hope you get a lot out of this. And if you have a question or you would like to put a question in the question box, we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. But please feel free to go ahead and put a question in there if you want to. Always have to give you a disclaimer. You know that we are not lawyers, and the information contained herein is not legal advice, and it's not tax advice, because we're not only are we not lawyers, but we're not tax professionals either. So I look at the world through the eyes of a human resources director, and I try to give you the information that I think I would want as I'm trying to manage day to day and comply with all of the HR laws that all of you or most of you are aware are out there. Now, the Fair Labor Standards Act is an interesting act because in 1938, when it was passed, believe it or not, there was no such thing as a 40-hour work week, something that we think is normal these days. There was just no concept of that in 1938. And if you're a student of history, you know that the Depression had been going strong for a few years at that point. Also, there was an issue with child labor. Children as young as about 7 were working long hours in mines and farms, and unfortunately, their work schedules interfered with their ability to get a good education. And so Congress passed this act in order to do a couple of things. One was to eliminate unfair child labor. Another was an interesting concept. If there's no overtime requirement, then what that meant was it could be in a business's best interest to hire employees and then make them work 60 or 70-hour work weeks, because they could pay them just a standard rate rather than any type of time and a half. And so it was to their benefit to just, have fewer employees on the books and work those they had harder. And so by instituting at that time a 44-hour work week, what that meant was that employers would hire more people and thus put more people to work to try to get us out of the Great Depression. Eventually, a few years later, the work week standardization went down to 40 hours a week. But anyway, I just thought you might like to know that little history of how the FLSA came into being. Now, right now, over 135 million workers in more than 7 million workplaces are protected by the FLSA, and it is enforced by the Wage and Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor. So if you ever have a question about the FLSA, and you want something official, there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet, and to make sure you go to a credible source, I would Google FLSA and then always follow whatever your search terms are by DOL, and so that will come back with some official Department of Labor publication for you to use, which is a safe publication. Now, who is covered? Honestly, it's probably safest to assume that your business is covered unless you've been told otherwise by a tax advisor or legal advisor. The FLSA officially applies to businesses with 2 or more employees whose total annual dollar volume in sales or business is $500,000, or who are engaged in interstate commerce. The courts have interpreted the term interstate commerce pretty broadly. So even if you use US mail to send things and none of your people speak to anyone or go outside of your state, that's still considered interstate commerce. So just be aware of that. But like I say, most of us are covered in any case. Now, I thought I'd say a word real quick about the FLSA and nonprofits. This gets a little bit tricky. So my little note at the bottom of this slide is to assume that all of your employees are covered if you're a nonprofit, and unless you've talked to legal counsel to exclude certain employees. Okay, so because what happens with the nonprofits is that the act breaks down the functionality, and some people based on function would be covered, and they some people may not be covered. If you have a thrift store or some type of commercial operation, they separate that from the people who actually work within the nonprofit. So it is tricky, and navigating that is something, if it were me, I would not do on my own. I would seek help above my pay grade to make sure that everything, that all of my people that are supposed to be covered are covered. Now, the jurisdictions of the Fair Labor Standards Act can be really summarized in this simple graphic. The Fair Labor Standards Act governs minimum wage, overtime, youth employment, and record keeping. And one of the nice things about what the DOL does, they really do produce a lot of good, succinct information that's all out there for you to use. And one thing that they do is they publish these things called fact sheets. And you may be familiar with the FMLA fact sheets, because sometimes when I'm dealing with our clients, I send copies of those fact sheets, or I quote them in my answers on, online or on the phone. And they're just one simple search away. If you go search a particular item like minimum wage, DOL, FLSA, that's almost guaranteed to take you somewhere to a fact sheet. And so as we go through this, remember that the FLSA is a federal law, so it applies to all states. However, states and localities can pass more generous laws, as we will see. So everything I'm telling you here is what the federal government says we have to do. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, which I believe covers most of where our clients work. I've tried to be consistent in providing information on all three of those states where there may be a variation from federal law, but always do some research to see if there's a different state law that governs a particular topic. And again, Google is your friend doing that. Now, here's a little example of a fact sheet. All right, this is almost what they all look like. This is fact sheet number 21, and I chose this one because it's fairly simple, and we're going to talk about record keeping in a few minutes. But this fact sheet lays out everything as an employer that you need to know about what you're required to keep, what information, and for the most part, how long. There are some other things that you have to keep as an HR person. For example, this would not dictate how long you keep your I-9 forms, because there's a whole separate set of rules governed by a different entity that deal with the I-9 forms. But this is your general like payroll records and that sort of thing. So just wanted you to be familiar with this. Most of them say WHD in the upper right corner so that you know you're in good standing. And honestly, if it were me, because there is industry specific information and rules, you might cruise the fact sheets and find your industry. And honestly, I print out stuff that I really want to have handy, like in a book form. And then, over time, your exemptions and that sort of stuff, and just punch that and put it into a binder. I know that flies in the face of our paperless world that we like, but I like sometimes just having things all together, and I don't have to, keep searching for something that I might need. Just open my little book and find what I'm looking for. All right, so the first thing on our list is minimum wage. The FLSA governs minimum wage, and as everybody probably knows this, because that gets talked about a lot in the media. Our federal minimum wage has not been raised since 2009, and it is right now $7.25 per hour. That's the federal minimum wage. Now, to complicate issues, there are some exceptions to that. You have different groups of people who are that you are able to pay a lower wage than the federal minimum. And also the fact that you must pay time and a half overtime for work over 40 hours in a week. So people under than 18 years of age cannot work in certain jobs, and additionally set rules concerning the hours and times that people under 16 work are also covered in this act. Now, many states and even some localities have a minimum wage that is higher than the federal minimum wage. So this is particularly important if you are a multi-state or multi-jurisdictional employer. For example, San Francisco has its own minimum wage. There are cities in Colorado that have their own minimum wage. I believe it's Alexandria, Virginia, that actually has a higher minimum wage for companies other than construction companies that do state and public money contracts. So if you have an office in Arlington, people working in Alexandria, my apologies, then you might want to look into that rule. But like I say, things get more tricky the more states and localities kind of wing it and do their own thing with paying people and requirements and that sort of thing. Now, right now in Virginia, our minimum wage is $11 an hour, which will go to $12 as of 1/1/23. There are additional increases, at least one scheduled, but that future increase is going to be subject to further state action. So anything increasing as of 1/1/24 is right now not a sure thing. So just be aware of that. North Carolina and South Carolina both have the use the federal minimum wage. Now, honestly, in the climate we're in today, the great resignation, employees leaving jobs, I'm doubtful that you find a whole lot of people that earn just the $7.25 per hour, but that is the legally the floor of the legal requirements under the FLSA. Now, as you know, I always joke about human resources and say that every question has the same answer, and that is always, you ask me a question about human resources, and it depends. So, no surprise here, the FLSA has exceptions to minimum wage. And some groups that may be exempted from the minimum wage would be farm workers, seasonal workers, tipped employees, minors and younger workers, full-time students and vocational workers, and some employees with disabilities if the disability limits the quality or quantity of their work. So be aware that if any of that applies to you, you need to familiarize yourself with what your minimum wage might be, your legal minimum wage. Unfortunately, going into detail about each one of those exceeds the scope of this presentation today. So that would be something you would need to do some research on your own or call your tax or legal representative. All right, so that's kind of the minimum wage is fairly simple. It's a dollar amount under the federal law or a different dollar amount under state or jurisdiction. Now, the second thing that we're all familiar with is overtime. We all know that overtime means that we have to pay our employees time and a half based on their number of hours in the work week. So 40 hours is the maximum that they can work before they go into time and a half overtime. Sounds so simple, doesn't it? Well, I know everybody out there is thinking, yeah, it sounds simple, but no, it's not. So here are the general rules, okay? As we just said, unless exempt from overtime, if the employee is covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, they've got to receive a rate of not less than time and a half their regular rate of pay for anything over 40 hours worked in a week. As with anything or most things mandated by law, you can be more generous than that. And I know that there are employers that say, well, if you work on a holiday or on a Sunday, we're going to pay those people double time. So you're perfectly welcome to do that. You simply cannot pay them less than what the federal law requires, and you cannot get them to sign any agreements or anything like that saying that they will accept less money, because that's a violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, who can work overtime or over 40 hours in a week? Actually, under the FLSA, there is no maximum number of hours that anyone aged 16 or older can work in any week. Now, some restrictions do apply. For example, North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina all have some type of restriction for people under the age of 16. And part of that deals with their ability to work nights. Some of that just deals with, what's happening during the school week and that sort of thing. So if you, it probably would be good if you have people that are under age 16 working for you, then make certain that you're following the rules. You should have a poster that has this posted on it. But anyway, make sure that you understand what the rules are for those younger people. Next is that the FLSA, we just talked about a premium for Saturdays, Sundays, holidays, etc. Remember that the FLSA does not require you to pay a premium or any overtime for Saturdays, Sundays, or holidays unless those days represent hours over 40 in your work week. Okay, so if your standard work week is Saturday through Friday, that's a 40-hour, that can be a 40-hour work week, and you're not required to pay anything special just because people are working on Saturdays and Sundays. Now, the Act applies on a work week basis that is defined by the FLSA as any fixed and regularly recurring period of 168 hours. That's 7 times 24. However, it does not have to coincide with the calendar or anything like that, but you may come up with your own scheme and have it begin and end on any day of the week at any hour of the day. So it has to be, however, consistent. You don't want to be changing your work week definition every third month. You need to be relatively consistent about that. You also can establish different work weeks for different groups of employees. Okay, so you might have a manufacturing business and your factory folks can have one definition of their work week and your administrative folks can have another definition. And the averaging of hours over 2 weeks is not permitted. All right, so overtime pay earned in a particular work week has to be paid on the regular payday for that pay period in which those wages were earned. And I think a long time ago, I remembered my husband worked, he was in IT and he worked an overnight shift. And for some reason, one week he had off only, I think it was Fridays, and the next week he had off Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Could never quite figure out what that was all about, but he did not get overtime at that job. And I wondered if either averaging may have been allowed at some point in time, or this is back in the dark ages, or it could be that they were just violating the law. I don't know, but anyway, be aware that you can't average hours. All right, now state overtime laws. Right now, 4 states have their own overtime laws. Remember, it can't be any less than time and 1/2 after 40 hours worked, okay? But you can be more generous. So, for example, if I think some of these states will automatically require employers to pay time and 1/2 after 8 hours worked in a day, so that they can come up with a scheme like that. And that's perfectly legal to be more generous with your calculation of overtime. Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina abide by the FLSA requirement. So again, this is one of those things that could be important to our multi-state employers. You may have heard of a law that was kind of called VAWA, Virginia Overtime Wage Act. I think back in 2020, they passed this act and it required Virginia employers to use this unique formula that was different from the FLSA to calculate the regular pay rate. I think that must have been, I wasn't in payroll at that time, but I'm guessing that was a real hardship for those employers who had to comply with that. Now, however, as of July the 1st, Virginia has returned to the FLSA formula. So hopefully that took a burden off those folks who had to suddenly adjust to this new way of calculating the regular rate. Now, this is where things get tricky. What must be included in the overtime calculation? All the compensation that falls into these categories, all right, their regular pay. So if you pay people by the hour, you have to include their regular pay rate in the calculation for their regular rate for overtime purposes. Any piecework that they receive, that has to be included. Certain bonuses have got to be included in their regular rate. Any shift differential they get paid, any commissions they get paid, and then room and board. Probably not too many people have a room and board situation. But the bottom line is this: overtime can fluctuate from week to week, the overtime rate that you have to pay people, depending on these things that you have to include in their regular rate of pay. So be aware of that. You know, I'm guessing that a lot of companies are structured so that there's not a lot of random kind of pay that you're giving people. But for those who do pay piecework, or you get like productivity bonuses, shift differentials, commissions, that sort of thing, yeah, that's going to mean a multitude of calculations every payday for people. Now, things that can be excluded from the overtime calculation. You can exclude little gifts, like you give company swag, raffle prizes, coffee, snacks, you know, small stuff like that. You don't have to include that in people's hourly compensation rate for purposes of overtime. Discretionary bonuses. Now, these are things that you can give and that you can take away. Okay, if you the employer have complete control over this bonus, you do not have to include a bonus in the overtime rate calculation. And I call some of these blue sky bonuses. You know, the boss is feeling good one day, walks in and says, wow, we've been really knocking it out of the park here lately, so we're going to give everybody $100. You don't have to include that bonus. If it's something that's not a recurring type thing, one-time recruiting bonus, you know, you had employees that went above and beyond during a hurricane or something like that, that you do not have to include that. However, there are things called non-discretionary bonuses that do have to be included. If you've put some type of challenge out to your employees and you've said, okay, if we meet this sales goal at the end of September, everybody's going to get a $500 bonus. Well, that is no longer a discretionary bonus, because what's going to happen is this objective standard is going to be met or not met. If you don't meet the sales goal, then you're not going to give any bonuses out. If you do meet it, you can't take that bonus back. You're going to have to deliver on that promise. And so if you do meet that, then you have to include that bonus in people's rate for that week and use it to calculate their overtime. So that can get tricky as well. You do not have to pay overtime for time not worked. So for example, somebody is out on vacation on Monday, take a long weekend, and they work 32 weeks, let's say they work 38 weeks on Tuesday through Friday, you do not have to pay time and a half for, what would that be, 6 hours from hour number 33 through hour number 40. You don't have to pay time and a half for that, because the person did not spend 40 hours or more working at their job for that one day. So also, if you pay people to buy back their leave at the end of the year, if they get show up or reporting pay, so for example, we don't know if we're going to need you today, but we want you to come in anyway. And so you show up, you sit around for an hour waiting to know if you're going to be utilized, and then you leave and you haven't done any work. That show up pay that you get paid an hour for just being there and not working, you do not have to use that in your overtime calculation. And obviously reimbursement like mileage, tools, cell phones, that sort of thing, that is not included in the overtime rate calculations. Overtime premium payments, that sounds kind of weird, because you're like, okay, wait a minute, I got to think that through. You know, you pay double time for work done on a holiday. You don't have to add that premium into the regular rate. Perks and conveniences with the employee's benefit. Gym memberships, fees, tuition, parking, reimbursement, adoption assistance, wellness programs, those do not factor into regular rates for overtime calculation, nor do profit sharing plans and stock options. All right, retirement and insurance plan contributions, legal services, 401k contributions, accident plans, et cetera. do not go into the overtime rate calculation. All right, now I think I've gotten ahead of myself and talked to you already about the discretionary bonus. Just make sure that you understand that just because you call it discretionary, that doesn't mean that it is discretionary. Okay, so the three main rules about what's truly discretionary is the employer has the sole discretion at or until the end of the period that corresponds to the bonus to decide whether to pay it. The employer has the sole discretion that corresponds to the amount, and the bonus payment is not made according to any prior contract, agreement, or promise, causing an employee to expect that payments. Like, if you set a goal each quarter that says for every quarter that we meet this productivity standard, you will get $500. That is a non-discretionary bonus, okay? Because you've made that promise and you have to keep that promise if they meet the goal. So that is not a discretionary, that is a non-discretionary bonus. All right, now our next topic is going to be exemptions. I get quite a few calls from employers about exempt employees. What is an exempt employee? And there's a lot of misunderstanding about what constitutes exemptions. And classifying people wrong can put you on the hook for back overtime pay, for some fines and that sort of thing. So it's really important that you classify people correctly and that you do not remove people from overtime pay by calling them exempt in an arbitrary way, that you go by the standards and make sure that you don't misclassify people. I think it's a good rule of thumb to assume that everyone gets overtime in your workforce. Everybody gets overtime, and then you can rule people out job by job or employee by employee. And everything, all this, I think I'll talk about this in a minute, all this starts with the job descriptions. And so what exempt and non-exempt mean is people on your workforce who may be exempt from minimum wage and overtime, all right? So you probably, everybody's mind goes to, the executives, the executive vice presidents, the senior vice presidents, and that sort of thing are going to be people who don't get overtime, which means they can work, their job can require them to work 40 to 60 hours a week, and they don't get any more money than what their agreed on salary was. You don't have to pay them any premium for working those extra hours. And so that's why it's important to classify people correctly, because people are legally entitled to time and 1/2 unless their job description and their actual performance puts them into an exempt category. Now, generally speaking, there are 5 types of exemptions generally, and you've got some other stuff out there too, as always. You have the exceptions and the exceptions to the exceptions. But okay, so the Fair Labor Standards Act provides an exemption for employees employed as bona fide executive, administrative, professional, outside salespeople, and then certain computer employees. That's such a weird designation, a computer employee. That's like your IT staff, the people who run your IT department. Some of those people may fall into an exempt category. And to qualify for an exemption, employees must meet certain tests regarding their job duties, okay? Now, just because you call a person salaried or because you pay them salary does not mean that they're an exempt employee, nor does their job title make them an exempt employee, okay? So I hear this from many sources, honestly, not just within my own work world, but I hear this from other people, and I read blogs and all that sort of thing, and they'll go, well, my salaried employee, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it makes me think, I hope you don't have that person classified wrong, because just because they're getting a salary does not mean that they're not exempt from overtime. So these are the 3 tests. In order to achieve an exemption for an employee, you've got to meet the salary level test, the salary basis test, and the job duties tests, okay? So they have to fulfill all 3 of those things. And so we're going to go over each one of these in detail. All right, so first is the salary level. Now, you may remember a couple of years back, there was this kind of hoopla about raising the exempt salary to a certain dollar amount. And initially, it was much higher than what it ended up to being approved at. But in any case, as of 1/1 of 2020, the exempt employee salary went to $684 per week. So if your employee, no matter what their job description or no matter what they're doing, if you don't pay them at least $684 a week, they are not exempt, okay? And even if that person is a part-time employee, you cannot prorate that salary. So I don't know why you would have a part-time exempt person, but that could come up. So somebody only wants to work 30 hours a week, and yet their job description and their duties actually put them into exempt job duties, and you're paying them, on a salaried basis each payday. They still have to be getting $684 a week. All right, so you cannot prorate that for part-time hours. Then there's this thing called a highly compensated exempt employee. And we're going to talk further about the rest of the tests, but these employees are people who make at least $107,432 per year, but they don't fulfill all of the tests. Okay, they have to direct the work of 2 or more employees, but they don't have to fulfill any of the other exemption tests. So you can imagine. I'm not sure what you can imagine. Who would get paid $107,000 a year? I'm guessing maybe some type of people that are really high up in your organization, but that do a particularly different type of job, but because they're so highly compensated and they do supervise 2 people, they can be thrown into the exempt category. So probably not very many people have a person that falls into that category, but it's certainly possible. And you'll notice on these, I try to put the fact sheet number on some of these slides so that you can see where those came from. But in any case, for us in the more normal workaday world, if we're calling people exempt, we have to be paying them at least $684 a week. All right, next is the salary basis. The employee must be paid on a salary basis. This employee regularly receives a predetermined amount of compensation each pay period. Right, so whatever their salary is, $684 or more, the compensation cannot be reduced because of variations in the quality or quantity of the work performed. And you need not pay your exempt employees for any work week in which they perform no work. However, if they perform any work in the work week, they work a half a day on Monday, and then they don't come back again for the rest of the week, you still have to pay them their $684 or more for that work week. You cannot dock their pay except under very limited circumstances if they work any part of the work week. So one thing to be aware of, the technology, it has really changed our lives a lot for the good and for the bad, but it's very difficult to track what employees are doing at home. And so, it's more important for non-exempt people for you to have a policy about what they do on behalf of the company while they're at home than exempt people. But it's still something you need to keep in mind in case you get into some type of discussion or disagreement with an exempt employee who says, wait a minute, I get paid for all of last week because I checked my emails on Sunday night and I've returned a few phone calls on Monday. So it probably pays to be aware of, or at least have some guidelines for at-home work, and just make certain that or you try to avoid those type of situations. All right, deductions from salary. An employee is not paid on a salary basis if deductions from the predetermined salary are made for absences occasioned by the employer or by the operating requirements of the business. And so the low-hanging fruit here is going to be, let's just say, inclement weather, right? You close your office for a day, and you're going to pay your exempt employees for that day and that whole week because you're the one that closed the office, and they were ready, willing, and able to work. So, you know, power's out in your building, there's a snow day, there's a hurricane coming, whatever, your exempt employees need to be paid for the time that they're absent for such occasions. Yeah, if the employee is ready, willing, and able to work, deductions may not be made for time when work is available. And let's see, I have this nice little chart here that unfortunately I do not have this on a slide, but I am going to try to include this on materials that we send you. We will send you these slides, by the way, as we usually do, so that you, if you're trying to make copious notes, that is not necessarily necessary. How's that for you? Because you will get the slides. But anyway, so there are certain things that what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go through these slides, and then no, I'm sorry, my apologies. I have too many papers that I'm trying to go by here in front of me. All right, salary basis, things that are permitted. All right, 7 things that you can withhold from people's pay. You can withhold a day's pay if somebody works one or more full days, one or more full days for personal reasons that don't have anything to do with sickness or disability. So somebody wants to take a day off to take a long weekend and they don't have any paid vacation leave, or you don't have a vacation or sick leave program, you can withhold that day from their pay. Absence or from work for one or more full days due to sickness or disability if you have a bona fide sickness or vacation policy. And this is kind of confusing, okay? If you don't have any type of absence policy, nobody gets sick days, sick time, it's formalized wage replacement for absences, then you can, then you cannot withhold absence, such an absence from their pay. If you do have a policy and they have exhausted all of their paid leave, then you can withhold it. And I think that's on the next slide. You cannot offset any amounts received as payment. You can offset any amounts received as jury fees, witness fees, or military pay. Okay, so if the person is gone for a half a day on jury duty, yes, they're going to get paid by the jury for the jury fee. You can pay them just the dollar amount that is less, more than what their jury fees were. Same with the witness fees and military pay. So in that case, you can deduct the amount of the jury fee. Now, you are also able to impose a fine or a penalty, if you do for everybody else, for violating safety rules of major significance, okay? And you'd have to use good judgment on that. So let's say your supervisor set foot on the production floor in her sock feet, and that's technically a safety rule, and then walks back into her office and puts her steel-toed shoes back on. You probably would not be able to penalize an exempt employee for that because that's not of major significance. However, if you were talking about things that could result in injury to people or hazards to your facility, then yes, you can penalize a salaried or, an exempt employee for that. You are permitted to take an unpaid disciplinary figure out of your exempt person's pay if they have violated workplace conduct rules. So if you say to them, okay, you violated a conduct rule, and so you're going to need to take 2 days off without pay. You're suspended for 2 days. Yes, you can withhold that. A proportionate part of an employee's full salary paid for time actually worked in the first and last weeks of employment. So, you have a new employee that starts on a Wednesday, and the rule about if they work part of the week, you have to pay them for all the week. Well, that does not hold true in the first week of employment and the last week of employment. So you can pay them for their actual hours worked on those 2 weeks. You may also deduct from their salary unpaid leave pursuant to the Family and Medical Leave Act. So we have an employee that goes out for 12 weeks. They get 6 weeks of pay through whatever your leave policies are, and then the final 6 weeks is going to be taken without pay. Yes, you may deduct that from your exempt employees pay. So I hope that clarifies a little bit your the things that you were able to deduct. And next we're going to cover the improper deductions. All right. And this is an interesting one. You cannot deduct for a partial day absence to attend a parent-teacher conference. Of course, that would fit in with the partial day absence. If they work a part of a day, you're going to pay them anyway, but they do specifically talk about parent-teacher conferences. You are not allowed to take the day off of the pay out of the pay because the facility was closed due to inclement weather. And again, we get back to the jury duty and that sort of thing, that you cannot deduct for the whole day if somebody's on jury duty. Deduction for a 2-day absence due to a minor illness if the employer does not provide wage replacement benefits for such absences, okay? So you have to be careful when you're deducting pay for absences based on whether or not you have a bona fide leave plan or whether or not you don't have a bona fide leave plan. All right, the consequences of improper deductions. If you improperly deduct from the employee's pay, you risk losing the exempt status of that employee and all similarly classified and supervised employees. So when you stop to think about that, that's a pretty hefty punishment for simply taking improper deductions. So meaning that if you have 5 people in the same exempt category and you've taken improper deductions from one of those, you could potentially lose the exempt classification of all those people. Also, you might have overtime liability for that employee, and you may have potential fines as well. All right, so there is a safe harbor. If the employer has a clearly communicated policy prohibiting improper deductions and including a complaint mechanism, okay, so in your employee handbook, if you have something in there about paying exempt employees and it says that, we make it a policy of the company to follow the law as far as making deductions from exempt employee pay. And if you believe that you have been unfairly compensated, here is the way you make a complaint, or here is the way you file a grievance or whatever. And then the second thing would be that once it comes to your attention that you have made an improper deduction, that you promptly reimburse employees for such deductions, and that you make a good faith commitment to comply in the future. Okay, so those are the things that you need to do in order to fall under this safe harbor. And fact sheet 17G will provide more information for you. All right. Now back to the salary basis test. Yes, the payroll practices. Here we go again. Just to have a picture's worth 1,000 words. You may take deductions from exempt employees' accrued leave accounts if they have taken leave. All right, so there's nothing wrong with exempt employees having leave banks for vacation and sick leave, and there's nothing wrong with you deducting from those leave banks when they take time off. There's nothing wrong with you requiring exempt employees to keep track of and record their hours worked. That does not violate the FLSA. Requiring exempt employees to work a specified schedule. Sometimes employers think that because the person is exempt and they don't get paid overtime, that they can pretty much come and go as they please, but that is not true. You can require a specified work schedule. And also, you are not violating anything if you implement a bona fide across the board schedule change. Okay, so you're not risking your exemption status, if your employee's exemption status, if you make changes across the board for employees. All right, so here we get into probably the nitty gritty. I don't know, maybe it's all the nitty gritty because you have to fulfill all of these 3 tests. The duties test, but this is where things can get somewhat unclear when you're trying to decide, is this person exempt or non-exempt? So really, it has, in my way of viewing it, it has kind of a 2-prong approach when you're talking about what people's like their duties definitions. The first one is, what does the job description say? And then the second is, what is the person actually doing? All right. So if it were me designing the job descriptions, I would put the duties that support the exempt status front and center of the job description. Those should be the most important and the most frequent jobs that the employee does, and those need to be at the top. And then remember, it's not the words on the job description that support the exempt status. It's the work the employee performs. And this may be a little bit surprising when I tell you that different employees may have the same job title, job description, and salary, but one of those people may be exempt from overtime and one may be non-exempt simply because of the work that they perform. And so here might be an example of that. Let's say that you have a couple of franchises of like little discount department stores that you see frequently on corners. And you have one that's in the middle of Virginia Beach, and you have one that's out in the Shenandoah Valley. The person who manages, or let's say the assistant manager of the store in Virginia Beach, may be tasked with doing all of those upper level jobs. So they may regularly be hiring people, be firing people, be counseling employees, be troubleshooting employee performance and all that sort of thing, which probably would rise to the level of being exempt duties, making big decisions about stuff. Whereas your little store out in the Shenandoah Valley may have fewer staff members. And so the assistant manager has to wear multiple hats, which includes occasional interviewing, maybe occasional disciplining of employees, but that person spends a lot of time actually running a register, stocking shelves, and all that sort of thing, but they have the same job titles and the same salary. So you can see where you're going to go by what the people actually do rather than what their job descriptions say, and that could vary from person to person. Remember that paying an employee on a salary basis does not make the position exempt. All right, now we get into the exempt categories. These are where you classify and determine whether or not these things make your employees exempt or not. All right, so in order to call someone exempt based on the executive exemption, you know by now that you have to pay them $684 a week, and the employee's primary duty has got to be managing the enterprise or a department or subdivision of the enterprise. The employee must customarily and regularly direct the work of at least 2 employees or their equivalent, so it could be 4 part-time employees, and they must have the authority to hire and fire workers, or if they don't do the actual hiring and firing, they make the recommendations for doing so, or changing the status of other employees, and their opinion must be given particular weight. Okay, so if an employee does not fulfill all 4 of those, then you cannot apply the executive exemption to that employee. Then there's an administrative exemption. This employee, again, has got to be paid $684 a week. The primary duty must be performing office or non-manual work that is directly related to management or general business operations of the employer or the customers. And the primary duty must also include the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. When I was an HR director in the legal industry, there was always a discussion about whether or not paralegals were exempt employees. And one of the hangups, because paralegals were highly skilled, highly qualified, intelligent people who really knew a lot about the law, but the question always was how independent can they be of the lawyers they work for? So that was kind of the phraseology that was the hangup on making most paralegals exempt employees. So defining work related to the management of the business would include things like, people, upper level people in your tax, finance, accounting, budgeting, auditing, insurance, quality control, purchasing, advertising, marketing, labor relations, human resources, public relations, all that sort of thing. All of those types of duties could potentially have duties that would rise to the level of an administrative exemption, but you have to be careful in using that admin exemption. If someone spends most of their day on a keyboard inputting, budget numbers and that sort of thing, and occasionally does something on a more sophisticated level, that person is just not going to be an administrative exemption. They're going to be a non-exempt employee because they're doing more clerical type of work, not decision-making type of work. Now, professional exemption would be, and again, some of this is kind of squishy. Again, the $684 a week, but they have to be working in some field that requires advanced knowledge that is predominantly intellectual in character and requires a consistent exercise of discretion and judgment, and the advanced knowledge must be in a field of science or learning, and the advanced knowledge must customarily be acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. I've seen people want to try to classify employees as professionals who they would call, like, I don't know, something, let's say somebody who works for a small company and might do 25% of spend 25% of their time sort of in human resources management, but then the other part of their time, or 75% of their time, actually providing some type of administrative or clerical support to the CEO. And I myself have worked in a position like this, where, for my own self, I wanted to be a professional exempt employee and not have to punch a time clock. But the fact was, my job actual duties did not rise to the level of the professional exemption. And so at least they've spelled it out here, where they're talking about science and learning and medicine and law and theology and accounting and that sort of thing. So it really has to be a very specialized type of background and education in order to have this type of professional exemption. All right, now there is a creative professional exemption, which, as you might imagine, means people that are in the artistic fields. And yes, those people can be considered creative professionals. And as the list here is long, I'm not going to read them all, but generally you're talking about a case-by-case determination, and you're talking actors, musicians, writers, people who invent or create scripts and that sort of thing. So chances are good, unless you're in a marketing and advertising agency or something like that, or you deal directly in the field of the arts, most of your employees, most of us are probably not going to encounter creative professionals, but some of us may have exclusively creative professionals, and you do have to kind of judge each individual role to make sure that if they're going to be exempt from overtime, that you can justify that. As you might imagine, outside salespeople, they do not have a salary requirement, but they do have to be customarily and regularly engaged away from the employer's place of business. All right, so there are places that probably have inside salespeople and outside salespeople. There is no exemption for an inside salesperson. There is only exemption for an outside salesperson. However, it is possible that even though the outside salesperson does not, the person does not qualify for an outside sales exemption, it's still possible that they could qualify as an exempt employee over one of the other exemptions. So there can be some crossover there with sales people, but fact sheet 17F will give you more information on, if you need it, on outside sales people. All right, now the computer or the IT person, if ironically or weirdly, they don't have strictly a weekly salary. Instead, they have to be compensated no less than $27.63 per hour. And again, this has to be a highly skilled individual. We're talking systems analysis. We're talking about, network engineers, certain types of programmers, designing systems, documenting, testing, that sort of thing, or a combination of all those things before they would be considered exempt people. So like computer operators, data entry people would not rise to the level of employee, of an exempt employee. Okay, don't let these common practices get you in trouble. Non-exempt employees, this is one I talked about before. You need to have clear policies on non-exempt employees working from home as far as during non-work hours. So my professional opinion would be to have a policy that says that your employees that are non-exempt are not authorized to access voicemails or emails except during working hours, not after hours, not on weekends. Because if you are not tracking the hours the employee is spending, the last thing you want is to, let's say you've had a problem employee and you're coming to the end of the road with that person and you're going to let them go. You don't want to let an employee go and give them a final paycheck and then have them say, well, you know, for the last 6 months, I've been putting in 5 hours a week at home on Saturday and Sunday, and now you owe me overtime for all that. So you don't want to get into a situation like that. So you want to make sure that all of your non-exempt employees know the parameters of working outside of work hours, whether it's just accessing voicemails or checking emails. You know, you could prevent non-exempt employees from logging in from home without company approval. That's one thing that you can do. Non-exempt employees should not be asked by anyone to run a little errand on the way to or from work or on their lunch hour unless that is documented and signed off by a supervisor. Okay, employees should not just be expected to do those kinds of things and then just act like they didn't spend the time doing it. Because in a dispute with an employee, you will bear the burden of proof that the employee did not work the time. And this is where technology is a two-edged sword. Now, what this does not mean that if you have the policy and the employee is violating the policy, you do need to pay them the overtime if they have actually done the work, or you can't prove they didn't do the work. You need to pay them the overtime, but you don't have to look the other way. That can be a disciplinary issue. So you can have a counseling session, show the employee the policy, explain how they violated the policy of checking emails or whatever after hours or at home, and then you can take disciplinary action against that person. Okay, so but you still need to pay them for the overtime, because if they did work it, you need to pay them for it. Now, think of sorry, I got to get back on my correct slide now. All right, think of it this way. It's the duties that make the employee exempt. It's not the employee that's exempt, it's the duties that are exempt, okay? So if you look at it that way, you're thinking, okay, as I'm putting together this job description and trying to decide where this person fits, what are the exempt duties on this job description? And then I would assume that everyone you hire is non-exempt. Then make exceptions based on your analysis of the duties performed, not only the job description, but what they actually perform, how you're paying them, and what the minimum salary is. All right, now the Department of Labor may change some of this up in October of 22. Just yesterday afternoon, I looked to see if I could find any updated information on this, but I did not. So just kind of be on the lookout for the minimum salary requirements to possibly increase. And also, I'm not sure what they're looking for, but the exempt duties tests may also be under review and subject to some changes. So just be aware of that. All right, now you're required to keep records. Surprise, surprise. I already showed you earlier the fact sheet that had the list of all these requirements. You do have to keep all of this. And though when you look at it, it seems like, well, that's a lot of stuff, but you know, most of this is right in your payroll system. So most of this stuff is being kept in payroll. So I don't think this should be any additional record keeping for you if you simply make certain that you have access to and you keep your payroll records so that you have access to them. And if you change payroll companies, make certain that you have a certain history. I believe it's 3 years. I think I'm going to find out in here in just a second. Hey, it's 3 years. Each employer shall preserve for at least 3 years the payroll records, the collective bargaining agreements, and then sales and purchase records. Now remember that you do have other records, as I said earlier, within your company that you have to keep longer than 3 years, or you may have to. So this is simply has to do with your Fair Labor Standards Act info is subject to that 3-year retention. Now it also says that the actual dollars are 3 years, but the computations on which those dollars are based is a 2-year retention schedule, like the time cards, piecework tickets, all that sort of thing. You need to keep that stuff for 2 years. Also, the DOL can inform you that they need to come in and look at your records. And so even though you can keep these records at your actual place of employment, or you can keep them far away in a records office, you do have to be able to put your hands on them. And I think that random DOL audits, I'm not sure that those are very common, but if you do have an employee that makes a complaint to the DOL, that that's going to more likely trigger something negative like an audit by the DOL. All right, now how do you keep time? Employers may use any timekeeping method. You can keep a time clock. You can have people log in and out on their computer. You can have a person designated as a timekeeper who keeps track of the employee's hours. Employees can fill in their own time on records. I know back in my prior lives, we've all been on a fixed schedule, and so every day you just check off that you work that day, 8:30 to 5, or whatever schedule you're working. You don't have to physically write that down every day. You just check a sheet that somebody has printed out for each week or each month. And then if the worker is on a job for a longer or shorter period, then that needs to be noted by the employers, just in case that means they're going to go into overtime, and they have to, get additional time and a half overtime pay. So basically, any timekeeping plan is acceptable as long as it's complete and accurate. And I would also say that it needs to be neat and legible. And because if the DOL does ever come calling, you really want to smooth their path for an easy audit. You don't want to put barriers in their way, because that does not generate goodwill, and you definitely want their goodwill. So make sure you also have good coffee on hand. Compensable time, do you know it when you see it? Now, this is way more complicated than one slide, okay? You've got all sorts of time that can come up that you say to yourself, do I have to pay people for that? So some forms of compensable time are easy. The employee punches in, sits down, goes to work, to lunch. That's all going to be compensable. Short breaks here and there for coffee. Then other times that may be a little bit less easy to spot. Activities that may be compensable depending on the circumstances. Your training time, travel time, I think that's got its own fact sheet. Meal breaks, if they are this long or that long, they're either going to be on the clock or off the clock. On-call time, depending on what is it, engaged to wait or waiting to be engaged? Depends on whether or not employees get to be paid for their on-call time. Pre and post work activities, donning and doffing of uniforms and gear, that may or may not be compensable. So just be aware, if you work in an industry and you're listening to me right now, you probably are already very well versed in these rules. But for those who may not be sure, just make certain that you're accounting for all the time you need to be paying people. All right. Youth employment, and we are, let's see, yes, we are going to land the plane here in the not too distant future, but youth employment is something that's governed by the Fair Labor Standards Act, and there are limitations on the employment for those under 18. Okay, for 16 and 17-year-olds, believe it or not, the Fair Labor Standards Act does not put a limit on the number of hours 16 and 17-year-olds can work in a week. All right, now, and they also can work in any occupation unless that occupation has been declared hazardous by the Secretary of Labor. And they are also allowed to work in an occupation that may have that may include jobs that are hazardous, but if this employee is not doing a hazardous job, then a 16 or 17-year-old. So for example, a construction company that builds high rises, no, they would not be able to go up and work on a high rise building. But if they're the file clerk that's working in the office, yes, they can do that because that's not hazardous. 14 and 15-year-olds may work outside of school hours for limited periods, only non-hazardous, and other limitations apply. With limited exceptions, no employment is permitted for children under 14 in any non-agricultural occupation. And remember that some states have laws that provide greater restriction and protection of minors as far as the hours they can work and the occupations they can work in. Now, I have a quick funny story here. One day, my husband and I were in a grocery store that has an eating area. And, you know, my eyes are always tuned in for HR related issues. And so we bought some food and I was going to heat mine up in a microwave that's provided for customers. And so I walked over and I got ready to put my food in the microwave, and I noticed there's this sticker on the microwave that talks about who can operate it, what employees can operate the sticker. And I'm like, wow, 16-year-old can't clean this thing? And as I was preparing for this webinar, I thought, heck, I wish I had taken a picture of that sticker to use on a slide, because I just thought that was kind of interesting. And so I had this idea. I'm like, hey, wait a minute. We got the internet. I'll bet you somebody somewhere has seen that, and that somebody has posted that sticker on the internet. Hey, guess what? There it is. There's the microwave. And that's the exact sticker that I saw. And somebody put this on Reddit, which I just thought was so funny. Prohibited for employees under age 16, so they can't use the microwave. Then it says 16, 17-year-old employees may operate, but may not clean. I can't read what that says. Or something oil or drain it. I don't know what you do with a microwave that involves a drain. I'm guessing that sticker maybe belongs on some other piece of equipment. But anyway, I just thought that was very interesting that A, I saw that in the grocery store, and B, that obviously somebody else did too online because they posted it. Okay, so minors and hazardous occupation. The FLSA prohibits minors under 18 to work in any occupation that it deems to be hazardous. And as you might imagine, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out that excavation, explosives, manufacturing explosives, mining, power tools and stuff may not be allowed to minors under 18. Okay, so be aware of that. And while the laws vary from state to state, regulations provide very specific information on these occupations, and it's true to form. Virginia and North Carolina both have on their websites about what is and isn't a hazardous occupation for minors. So I think it's all spelled out there if you go on to those links if you have any questions about that. All right, now we're going to talk for just a minute about FLSA enforcement. Who enforces it? We talked about the wage and hour division of the Department of Labor. If they find a violation, the WHD secures agreement to comply in the future and supervises voluntary payment of back pay as applicable. A 2-year statute of limitations generally applies to back pay. If it's willful, it'll be a 3-year statute of limitations. If they cannot get a voluntary agreement, then the wage and hour division may sue you or your company to restrain the employer from violating the FLSA and/or back wages and liquidated damages. And employees also have the right to file a private suit for back pay, liquidated damages, and attorney and court fees, which means that your employee does not have to go through any government agency. They can go directly to their lawyer of choice to file a suit to recover what they feel that they're owed, plus their legal fees. Penalties, fines that are in the thousands of dollars. Violators of youth employment are subject to civil money penalties, and willful repeat violations of minimum wage or overtime are subject to civil monetary penalties for every violation. So you really don't want to tangle with the WHD and over FLSA violations. All right, now here is, we're getting down to the last slide here, but I thought you might find this interesting. I can remember years ago, I cannot remember why I was calling the Department of Labor. This is before the computer age. And I called the DOL. I'm sure it was a 1-800 number, and it answered, but before it gave me options to get through to a human being, it asked a list of questions, or it said something like, if you're calling to report your employer for not giving you a lunch break, if you're over 18, the employer is not required to give you a lunch break. If you are calling to complain that you did not get paid when you worked on a time and a half when you worked on Sunday, your employer does not have to pay you over. In other words, it was this whole list of things that must be very common questions from employees calling thinking that their employer did something wrong. Okay. And I just thought that was kind of humorous that they went through this at least minute-long Q&A before, and then it's like, okay, if you still want to talk to somebody, press 1. All right, so contrary to popular belief, the Fair Labor Standards Act does not require anyone, any company, to provide vacation, holiday, severance pay, sick pay, none of that. Now, many state laws do require some of that, all right, but the federal government does not require any of that. And some, collective bargaining agreements may require it. The FLSA, or the federal government, does not require any meal or rest breaks for anyone over 18, does not require any holidays off, does not require any vacations. And so what that basically means is you and your employer, or the employee and the employer, reached a deal over what you're going to receive in addition to your cash compensation or your money compensation. So, if your employer gives you 30 minutes for lunch, there's nothing that said they can't. If your employee says we don't have break periods around here, eat at your desk, they can do that too. They don't have to provide meal or rest periods. Now, there are certain other laws that do require such things, but the Fair Labor Standards Act does not require that for anyone over 18. Does not require any type of premium pay for working holidays or weekends. All right, now you get time and a half overtime if you do work over 40 hours in a week, or if that weekend work causes you to go over 40, but otherwise they don't have to pay you for weekend and holiday work. They would have to pay you extra. They don't, the FLSA does not require the employer to notify the employee of why they are being let go. When it's unless there's a state law that says you do, you mostly are on a situation where you're an employee at will. The FLSA does not limit the number of hours or days an employee may work, except for some minors. And the limits of the FLSA, that it does not require that you give people raises or provide them with any fringe benefits. So just be aware of that. And sometimes employees are misinformed about some of those things. But now remember, if you put this in a handbook that you do provide these things, then you really need to stick with what you've got in your handbook. Otherwise, you may end up in trouble with multiple agencies, okay, if you violate the terms of your handbook. And let's see, and yes, this could also be changed by a collective bargaining agreement, which may require some or all of the above. All right, on your final page, you're going to see the some helpful resources, links to all of these things. If you don't have ready access to all this info, by all means, just click on the links and you can find out hopefully more than you ever wanted to know about the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I was sorry that Corbin could not join us today, but I thank you for your attention. And let me see if we've got anything in the way of questions here. Let's see if I can. Okay. How do we get this kind of information with regard to Virginia? Yeah, that's a good question. Virginia Department of Labor and Industry, the DOLI, has some publications that are out there. I will try to find, sometimes there's an abundance of information, sometimes there's a lack of information, but I will see if I can find something that might fit that bill, and try to include at least a link when we send you your info. about they'll send you a link along with the slides and that sort of thing. And this is being recorded, so we're going to post that at some point on our website, and we'll send you a link to it when we do get that recording up and running. And so that is the end of our presentation. I really thank you all so much for participating, and as always, for sticking with it to the end. I truly hope that you got something out of this, and that if you learned one or two things that might be helpful, and you know that you've got my information there, my email address, please feel free to email me with questions or any feedback or any of that sort of thing. And I am more than happy. It is one of the delights of my job to hear from our clients and to be able to help you navigate things to do with HR and benefits, because I know you've got a tough job, and that is one of our purposes here, is to be a resource for you all, both in the compliance area and in the HR area, just to try to make your job a little bit easier, because I know many of you wear many hats. So thank you so much for your time and your attention, and I do look forward to seeing you again next time, which probably before the end of the year. Thanks, and have a great rest of your week.